In the autumn of 1700, the most powerful throne in Europe was occupied by a man whose body was already a walking corpse. This man was Charles II of Spain, the final ruler of the Habsburg dynasty. It was said that his own courtiers murmured that he was possessed by demons during the final months of his life because he was in such a frightening state. During those final days, they witnessed a dynasty that had governed for generations fall along with the decaying body of its final heir. This event would stay with them for the rest of their lives and forever haunt European history. The death of Charles II would not only bring an end to the Habsburg line in Spain, but it would also plunge an entire continent into a catastrophic conflict that would bring about a shift in the balance of power that would last for decades. However, the ultimate horror was not in the political repercussions. Rather, it was in the horrible spectacle of a human being slowly decaying while desperate courtiers performed increasingly harsh rites in an attempt to preserve both their king and their empire. This is the tale of how centuries of royal inbreeding resulted in the creation of a monster of human pain, and how the dying days of the agony of one man altered the sequence of events that occurred throughout the history of the globe. It has been difficult for many historians to depict the entire depth of Charles's suffering, since the medical records and eyewitness stories from his deathbed paint a picture that is so unpleasant. As you are about to hear, you will not only be hearing the account of the death of a monarch, but you will also be hearing a testimonial to the dreadful effects that can result from absolute authority being perverted by genetic calamity. The desperate efforts of the Spanish court to save their dying monarch would shed light on the most egregious aspects of the medical and superstitious practices of the 17th century medical system. Over the course of more than 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburg family administered one of the most expansive empires in the world, which encompassed huge areas ranging from the Americas to the Philippines. At the end of the 16th century, Spain continued to be a strong power, but the empire and the dynasty that ruled it were beginning to show signs of weakness. For many years, the Habsburgs had engaged in the practice of strategic marrying, with the belief that this would ensure the purity of their bloodline and the consolidation of their rule. In 1661, Charles II was born as the result of generations of purposeful inbreeding, which had been going on for ages. Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, who were his parents, were his uncle and niece, respectively. The troubling pattern of close family links extends all the way back to his great-grandparents, who were his first cousins. His grandparents were close relatives. The Habsburg family tree had become so entwined by the time Charles was conceived that he had an inbreeding coefficient that was higher than that of children born to full siblings. This was because Charles was the 8th child of the Habsburg family. For a long time, the Spanish court had been aware of the fact that their royal dynasty was producing offspring who were becoming increasingly unstable. Philip Prospero, Charles's older brother, had passed away when he was only 4 years old, and a number of other possible heirs had passed away while they were still children or infants. In light of the fact that the future of Habsburg power in Spain was totally dependent on Charles's survival, the pressure that was placed on him to survive and produce an heir was enormous. Almost from the moment he was born, Charles exhibited the physical and mental impairments that would continue to torment him throughout his whole life. Until he was 8 years old, he was unable to walk, and he did not speak clearly until he was considerably older. Having suffered from what contemporary reports describe as an enormous tongue and a significantly projecting jaw, in addition to a multitude of other deformities, his mental capacity was severely limited, and he was prone to seizures and bouts of conduct that he was unable to control. Despite the fact that he had these visible infirmities, Charles was anointed king of Spain in 1665, when he was only 4 years old, following the death of his father. During the time when he was still a minor, his mother, Queen Mariana, held the position of regent. She did this in an effort to keep up the appearance that her son was capable of controlling one of the most powerful empires around the world. A growing number of surrounding powers began to circle the Spanish court like vultures, which resulted in the court becoming increasingly isolated and worried. There was a sense of weakness in Europe's political condition, which made it vulnerable. While the Holy Roman Empire, led by Leopold I, was working to preserve the delicate balance of power. Louis XIV of France was expanding his territory and his sphere of influence. Because of their connections to the Habsburg family, both monarchs had legal claims to the Spanish throne, and they were waiting for Charles II to pass away without leaving an heir by their side. Given the current state of affairs in Europe, the topic of Spanish succession had emerged as the most critical diplomatic issue. On two separate occasions during his reign, Charles II had resorted to marriage in an effort to have a child and become an heir. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orleans ended in 1689, when she passed away under unknown circumstances, presumably as a result of poisoning, after she was unable to bear children under his care. Despite the fact that Charles's physical state made it highly unlikely that he would be able to father children, his second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg were likewise unsuccessful. At the beginning of the year 1700, when Charles was entering his final year, the Spanish court was in a state of panic that was barely under control. As time went on, the king's health continued to deteriorate. Desperate courtiers were turning to increasingly drastic means in an effort to either heal their monarch or at the very least extract a clear succession plan from him before he passed away. Foreign countries were positioning themselves for the inevitable succession crisis that was going to occur. During the fall of 1700, Charles II had a sharp increase in the rate at which his physical decline developed. According to the documentation provided by the court physicians, the king was no longer able to walk without help since his legs were unable to support his frail body. His famed Habsburg jaw had gotten so prominent that he was unable to properly close his mouth. This resulted in him drooling all the time and made it practically impossible for him to understand what he was saying. In the event that he attempted to consume food, it frequently fell out of his mouth, and swallowing became an increasingly challenging task for him. Charles's appearance was noted as being quite unsettling by all who came into contact with him. According to contemporary records, the embassy from Venice stated that the king's face was terrifyingly pale and that his eyes were huge and prominent, giving the impression that they were protruding from their sockets. His skin had taken on a waxy, almost translucent look, and his hair had started falling out in sections, leaving him half-bald despite the fact that he was only in his late 30s. Parallel to the decline in his physical health, the king's mental state had also deteriorated. Before suddenly breaking into fits, he would frequently look blankly for hours, giving the impression that he was blissfully unaware of his surroundings. Palace servants stated that he would sometimes speak to invisible persons, carrying on intricate discussions with empty air, or become persuaded that he was being pursued by dark entities that only he could see. This was in addition to the fact that he would sometimes scream or laugh uncontrollably. His digestive system had, in all likelihood, stopped functioning in the appropriate manner. According to the documents filed with the court, Charles suffered from severe diarrhea, and thus, he frequently urinated at official events, much to the dismay of the dignitaries who were present. The tiniest amounts of food, which were typically watered wine or broths with a thin consistency, were the only ones he was able to consume, and even these meager nourishments were frequently thrown up again within a few hours. The dying king struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep. However, when palace guards would rush to his chambers, they would find him alone, cowering in his bed and alleging that demons were tormenting him. This was despite the fact that they had reported hearing him screaming in terror throughout the night. The severity of his insomnia increased to the point where he would sometimes go days without getting any rest that was remotely meaningful, which further accelerated his physical and mental decline. Due to the fact that the odor that emanated from Charles's body grew so offensive, courtiers would apply perfume to themselves before entering his presence. According to a number of tales, he was always accompanied by a sweet and sickly odor of decay that appeared to follow him wherever he went. It was said that his breath was so terrible that even his closest advisors would fight to keep from retching whenever he spoke to them directly. The seizures that had started to rattle his body with increasing frequency were perhaps the most unsettling of all the symptoms he was experiencing. He would eventually find himself writhing on the floor, his eyes rolling back, foam spilling out of his mouth, and his body convulsing in an uncontrollable manner as a result of these experiences. The time it took him to recover from each seizure was longer than during the previous one, and spectators saw that he appeared to lose a little bit more of his humanity with each assault. The treatment that the royal physicians were providing for their patient left them extremely perplexed. In an attempt to slow Charles's unstoppable descent into death, they had attempted bloodletting, purging, and a variety of herbal medicines. However, none of these proved to be successful. As they were in a desperate situation and had exhausted all of the conventional treatments available to them, they started to get the suspicion that natural therapy alone would not be enough to rescue their king. Over the course of the last few months of the year 1700, Charles II's condition continued to deteriorate, and the Spanish court came to embrace increasingly desperate and supernatural explanations for their king's suffering. After exhausting their medical knowledge, the royal physicians began to whisper that it was possible that the king's maladies were not the result of natural causes. Theologians and priests from the court were called upon to examine Charles, and many of them came to the conclusion that his symptoms were consistent with suffering from demonic possession. The choice to continue with the exorcism process was not decided on a whim. Before sanctioning such drastic measures, the Spanish Inquisition, which was still a formidable force in the year 1700, demanded a substantial amount of evidence and testimony. A number of witnesses were questioned in order to provide testimony regarding the peculiar behaviors of the king, his conversations with unseen creatures, and his miraculous strength while seizures were occurring. The evidence that, in the imaginations of the superstitious individuals who ruled the Spanish court, the spectacle appeared frightening. In order to personally examine the monarch, Father Antonio Maricolar, who was the head exorcist of the palace, was called upon. His report, which has been preserved in Spanish archives, characterizes Charles as displaying all of the usual indicators of satanic possession. These signs include speaking in tongues that are unknown to English speakers, displaying power that is beyond human capabilities, and revealing knowledge of events that he could not possibly have witnessed. It was urged by the priest that quick and intensive exorcism measures be carried out. A chilly evening in November was the setting for the first official exorcism, which took place in the private apartments of the monarch. Father Maricolar began the lengthy Latin prayers that were intended to drive out bad spirits. Charles was shackled in his bed while the prayers were happening. The response received from the king was instantaneous and terrible. His screams were described by witnesses as coming from a variety of voices, some of which were high-pitched like those of a kid, while others were deep and guttural like the growl of an animal. Exorcism sessions quickly became public spectacles, and members of the Spanish nobility were invited to see the war for their king's soul. Additionally, the sessions were held in public. Priests would surround Charles's writhing body with holy water and incense while he was shackled to his bed with leather straps. All the while, Charles would be bound to his bed. With each session, the king's reactions became more violent, as he would scratch at his bindings until his wrists bled and bite his own tongue until his mouth filled with blood. He would also bite his own tongue until his mouth was filled with blood. Charles yelled prayers and curses in Spanish, Latin, and what observers claimed were unknown demonic tongues during these gruesome sessions, which frequently lasted for hours at a time. The toll on someone's body was significant. The monarch would be left comatose and hardly breathing after each exorcism, and his body would be covered in scars, bruises, and burns as a result of the holy water that had been repeatedly poured over him. On the basis of the few intervals of lucidity that Charles occasionally demonstrated after the sessions, the Spanish court was able to convince itself that the exorcisms were successful. Sometimes, during these times, he would speak more clearly or appear to recognize familiar faces, which the priests understood as temporary wins against the demonic forces. At other times, he would appear to recognize familiar individuals. The majority of the time, however, these improvements were just temporary, and Charles would quickly return to the anguish that he had experienced in the past. The news of the royal exorcism quickly went across Europe, producing a widespread excitement among the courts of other countries. It was written by the French ambassador to Louis XIV that the Spanish had lost their minds along with their king. Meanwhile, Protestant nations utilized the spectacle as evidence of Catholic fanaticism and the collapse of the Spanish. The exorcisms had evolved into more than just a medical treatment. They had become a symbol of Spain's desperate struggle to sustain its waning dominion through the intervention of supernatural forces. The Marquis de Louville, who was an unofficial French observer at the Spanish court, left behind one of the most thorough accounts of Charles II's final months. He was a member of the French court. It was centuries later that his secret messages to Versailles were found in French archives. These dispatches provide a terrible first-hand perspective on the state of the king. The spectacle that is presented by Catholic majesty is so pathetic that even his adversaries would feel compassion for him. Louville described witnessing one of the exorcism sessions, writing that the scene was more horrifying than any torture chamber he had seen in his service to the crown. He said, "He speaks with great difficulty, his jaw hanging open in a perpetual grimace that renders his words nearly incomprehensible." Louville explained that he had witnessed the exorcism session. The screams of the king reverberated throughout the hallways of the palace, prompting the attendants to cross themselves and mumble prayers for protection into their ears. His Majesty lay as quiet as a corpse when the priests finally stopped their ministerial duties, and his respiration was so feeble that we feared he had passed away. There are extensive medical records that were kept by Dr. Miguel Fernandez, the personal physician of the king, and they have been preserved in the palace archives. Through the use of clinical precision, his notes reveal the extent to which Charles's physical condition had deteriorated. "The patient's digestive system has ceased to function normally," he wrote in October of the year 1700. For example, he is unable to retain solid food and suffers from continuous evacuation of the bowels. His limbs have become so weak that he must be carried like a child, and his mental faculties appear to diminish daily. Dr. Fernandez also documented his growing frustration with the court's decision to turn to supernatural remedies. "The exorcisms exhaust the patient terribly," he said to reporters. As the court's desperation increased, his professional medical opinion was increasingly ignored. Whatever temporary improvement might be observed is quickly negated by the physical trauma of these sessions. "I fear we are hastening his death rather than that we are preserving his life," he said. It is possible that Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was Charles's second wife, presented the most sensitive and personal account of the king's suffering. It was a terrifying experience for her to have to share living quarters with her husband, who was deteriorating, as she described it in letters to her sister in Germany. "He wakens screaming every night, convinced that demons are pulling at his limbs," she stated in her article. The Queen's letters reveal the political pressure she faced to either find a way to cure her husband or to extract a clear succession statement from him. "I have requested separate chambers, as the smell of decay that emanates from his body has become unbearable. I fear for my own sanity if I must continue to witness his torment," Queen Elizabeth I wrote. "The entire court watches my every move, hoping I might succeed where physicians and priests have failed," she said in her letter. Palace servants, who were rarely literate enough to leave written accounts, provided oral testimonies that were recorded by visiting dignitaries. They expect miracles from a wife who can barely stand to be in the same room as her husband. "The burden of maintaining this dying dynasty has fallen upon my shoulders alone," the palace servants expressed. It was reported to the Venetian ambassador by a chambermaid that she had witnessed the king crawling on his hands and knees around the hallways of the palace at night, wailing like a wounded animal and clawing at the walls until his fingernails bled. He was reportedly found by guards in the chapel of the palace, where he was groveling before the altar and pleading with God to either heal him or save him. The Spanish nobles found themselves in a difficult position because they were torn between their allegiance to the monarchy and their dismay at the transformation of their king. According to a letter that the Duke of Alba sent to a friend, attending court had become a challenge that puts even the most robust constitution to the test. One's confidence in the divine right of monarchs is put to the test when they witness majesty being brought to such a dismal state. We keep up the appearance that we are serving a monarch, But in reality, we are only spectators to a prolonged period of anguish that is associated with death. At the end of October 1700, it had become abundantly evident to all those who were present at the Spanish court that Charles II was entering the latter weeks of his life. It was no longer possible for the king to get out of bed, and the small bouts of consciousness that he experienced were becoming increasingly uncommon. Due to the fact that his physique had deteriorated to such a degree, courtiers referred to him as resembling a living skeleton, with his skin stretched over bones that were exposed. A grave situation had developed in the political sphere. The Habsburg claim to the throne would be killed along with Charles unless he could be persuaded to choose a clear successor. European countries were openly contemplating the partition of Spanish territory at the time. Archduke Charles of Austria and Philip of Anjou, the two most prominent possibilities, each having followers at court, which resulted in fierce factional struggle even as the king lay dying. During the short times that Charles was able to think clearly, he was constantly forced to write a will that named his successor. As a result of the fact that the physical effort required to wield a pen had become beyond his powers, royal scribes would attempt to guide his hand across the paper using their hands. The signatures that were produced were hardly identifiable scrolls, which led to subsequent disagreements on the legitimacy of the signatures. With the expectation of obtaining a deathbed proclamation in favor of their candidate, the competing groups would take turns paying a visit to the monarch who was nearing the end of his life. As the nearing of death approached, the exorcisms continued with a greater degree of severity. When Charles showed symptoms of consciousness, Father Mauritier and his team of priests kept a nearly continual vigil over the king's bedside. They performed a condensed version of the ritual anytime Charles showed signs of consciousness. The priests took the king's calmer suffering as evidence that the demons were finally being driven out of the kingdom. The king's responses had gotten weaker. The provision of medical care had been largely abandoned in favor of the assistance of spiritual practitioners. Dr. Fernandez was no longer consulted, and the few surviving physicians who attended to the monarch were given the directive to restrict their treatment to ensuring that he was as comfortable as possible. Pain alleviation was regarded as having the potential to be detrimental to the process of exorcism, since the priests believed that Charles's suffering was essential in order to rid his body of the evil spirits that were attached to it. Because she was unable to bear witness to her husband's terminal degeneration, Queen Maria Anna had removed herself from her husband's bedside for the most part. In an effort to ensure that she would be in a position to secure her own position in the upcoming succession issue, she spent her time desperately communicating with European courts. During this time period, her letters portray a woman who is on the point of her own mental breakdown. She is divided between remorse about abandoning her dying husband and the temptation to take her own life. I am filled with dread at the idea of witnessing his passing. The palace had taken on the air of a death watch during the course of the day. The regular activities that were part of court life had been paused, and servants went along the halls while whispering to one another. Ambassadors from other countries submitted daily reports to their respective governments, each of them attempting to be the first to proclaim the death of the king and the beginning of the succession crisis that would eventually transform the political landscape of Europe. The final conscious act that Charles apparently performed was to obtain the final sacraments that the Catholic Church had to offer. Witnesses reported that the monarch appeared to be unaware of what was going on around him, despite the fact that the event was carried out in his bedroom with the entire pomp that was required by Spanish etiquette. As a result of his lack of power, he was unable to make the sign of the cross without assistance, and his responses to the priest's inquiries were barely audible murmurs. On the first day of November in the year 1700, which was the last day of Charles II's life, palace witnesses characterized the atmosphere as being spooky and peaceful. The monarch, who had been wailing and convulsing for a number of months, lay still in his bed. His breathing was so shallow that attendants had to get quite close to him in order to detect any sign of life. The severe seizures that had plagued him throughout his final weeks had abruptly stopped, and in their place was an almost tranquil stillness that many people interpreted as a sign that the exorcisms had finally been successful. Father Mauritier kept his watch by the side of the king's bed, murmuring prayers and occasionally placing holy relics on the king's forehead. He did this while maintaining his vigil. Charles's eyes remained closed, but his lips moved frequently in what the priest interpreted as silent prayers or possibly final chats with the occult powers that had plagued him. Charles's eyes remained closed. The room was filled with the quiet sound of Latin chants from the assembled clergy, and the room was filled with the smell of burning incense. Over the course of several hours, members of the Spanish nobility started to congregate in the antechambers that were located outside of the king's bedroom. The mood was strained with expectancy, and there was a hint of relief that was hardly suppressed. A great number of people had become weary of the months of pain that they had observed, and some of them muttered that death would be a mercy for their ruler, who was being tormented. Nobody was ever too far away from thinking about the political repercussions that would result from the death of the king. Around the middle of the day, Charles opened his eyes for a moment and seemed to recognize a few of the people who were gathered around his bed. Witnesses said that he made an effort to communicate, but he was only able to emit a few sounds that were incoherent before his eyes rolled back, and he fell back into unconsciousness once more. Despite the fact that his body would continue to battle for several more hours, this fleeting glimpse of awareness would constitute his final moment of consciousness. After several months of intense anguish, the moment of death arrived in a manner that was nearly unnoticeable and completely unexpected. At roughly 2:30 in the afternoon, the physicians working in the palace discovered that the king's respiration, which had been previously lacking in strength, had completely stopped. They were afraid that he would suddenly come back to life, as he had done on other occasions in the past during episodes that appeared to be death. As a result, they waited several minutes before officially declaring him dead. The immediate aftermath was meticulously planned in accordance with the proper decorum of the Spanish royal family. Before being examined by the court physicians, the body of the monarch was allowed to remain undisturbed for exactly 1 hour. Following the conclusion of the final prayers, Father Mauritius stated that the devils had been successfully driven from the royal bones. With the arrival of the Spanish nobility in the palace, they immediately started the difficult task of addressing the succession crisis that they had been anticipating for a very long time. Within a matter of hours, word spread from the palace that Charles had passed away, despite the fact that the news was meant to be kept secret until official notifications could be issued. The news that would ultimately lead to the War of Spanish Succession was being spread across Europe by messengers who were racing across the continent by the evening. Over the course of several years, the major European countries had been making preparations for this imminent moment, and almost immediately, orders to mobilize were given. A formal notification of her husband's passing was delivered by officials from the palace to Queen Maria Anna, who had been absent from her husband's deathbed previously. It was reported that her emotion was one of evident relief rather than grief. However, she soon controlled herself in order to complete her ceremonial obligations as the widow of the monarch who had passed away. Due to the fact that she would not be performing any formal duties inside the government of Charles's successor, her own political future remained uncertain. It was on November 3, 1700, that the royal physicians Dr. Miguel Fernandez and Dr. Antonio Jenga performed an autopsy on Charles II. The results of this autopsy revealed the entire scope of the genetic calamity that had befallen the Spanish Habsburg line. Their thorough report, which has been preserved in the Spanish Royal Archives, presents a medical document that is so unsettling that many historians have struggled to describe its contents to audiences living in the modern era. Upon entering the chest cavity of the monarch, the physicians found what they described as a heart that was the size of a child's fist, in addition to being blackened and shriveled like a piece of leather that had been exposed to the sun for an excessive amount of time. Due to the significant scarring that was present on the heart muscle, it looked that the king's heart muscle was barely functioning during his final years. Dr. Fernandez remarked that it is inconceivable that this organ was able to maintain life for such a long period of time, given that it is not even quite comparable to a human heart that is in good shape. In addition to exhibiting signs of a persistent infection, it was discovered that the king's lungs were filled with fluid. Charles's chronic breathing issues and his inability to speak clearly were explained by cavities that were created as a result of large parts of the lung tissue having virtually rotted away. He had been functioning with less than half of the normal lung capacity for the majority of his adult life, according to the estimates provided by the medical professionals. The state of Charles's brain was perhaps the most alarming aspect of the situation. When the skull was opened, the doctors discovered what they characterized as a brain that was so little and damaged that it appeared to be more appropriate for a toddler than it was for an adult. There were numerous cysts and what seemed to be ancient hemorrhages in large parts of the brain tissue, which suggested that the tissue had decayed. According to the report, the most remarkable thing about His Majesty is not that he had fits and mental disarray. Rather, it is that he was able to think rationally regardless of the circumstances. Please take note that it was discovered that the digestive system of the king was in a state of full failure. His stomach was highly ulcerated and contained very little acid, which explains why he was unable to digest meals in the correct manner. He was experiencing persistent digestive difficulty, which can be attributed to the fact that his intestines had evidence of chronic inflammation and partial blockage. The liver was enlarged and hardened, which is an indication of long-term toxicity that may have been induced by the several medications that he had been taking during his life. The examination of Charles's skeleton revealed the full extent of the defects that had been a problem for him throughout his entire existence. With his jaw structure being so twisted, his spine was excessively bent, his ribs were misshapen, and his jaw structure was so distorted that it would have been practically difficult for him to eat or speak normally. It was observed by the medical professionals that the bones of His Majesty appeared to be those of a man twice his age, as they were fragile and distorted as a result of a lifetime of suffering. Moreover, the most unsettling aspect of the situation was the discovery of what the medical professionals referred to as putrefaction of the internal organs while the patient was still alive. There were indications of deterioration in a number of organs, which are generally only seen after a person has passed away. This indicates that certain sections of Charles's body had literally started to rot while he was still alive. The discovery served to provide an explanation for the foul odor that had been emanating from his body throughout the last few months of his life. The conclusion of the autopsy report included a comment that has gained widespread recognition among those who study the history of medicine. It is a miracle that this body was able to sustain life for 39 years. According to the magnitude of the malformations and deterioration, it appears that His Majesty endured a great deal more suffering than was visible to those who were observing from the outside. Torments that no human person should be made to face must have been relieved by death, which must have been a glorious deliverance. Initially, the findings of the physicians were kept a secret because they depicted such a horrible picture of royal suffering that the Spanish court thought they may undermine the reputation of the monarchy. On the other hand, copies of the report eventually made their way to other European courts, where they were utilized as evidence of the decline of the Spanish Habsburg line and as reason for the impending conflict for succession. The death of Charles II was the spark that ignited the most momentous conflict in Europe since the 30 Years' War. The main nations immediately began positioning themselves to claim sections of the huge Spanish Empire after Charles II's death. Within a few days following the king's passing, both France and Austria began to organize their forces, both asserting that they had rightful rights to the Spanish throne as a result of their relationship to the Habsburgs. On the basis of a will that Charles had reportedly signed in his closing weeks, Louis XIV of France moved swiftly to back his grandson Philip of Anjou's claim to the Spanish crown. The will named Philip as Charles's heir. The authenticity of this will, on the other hand, was immediately called into question by delegates from Austria. They maintained that Charles had signed it while he was mentally incapable and potentially under the power of a demon. Considering the peculiar events that transpired during the king's final months, there was sufficient reason to question his mental health. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold simultaneously declared his own son, Archduke Charles, to be the true king of Spain. He did this by using both the blood rights of the Habsburgs and the uncertain circumstances surrounding Charles II's deathbed will. This was done in order to establish legal grounds for rejecting any document that he had signed. In his argument, Leopold contended that any decisions regarding the succession that the Spanish king had made were illegal because of his clear mental incompetence, which was demonstrated by years of unpredictable conduct and the belief that he was under the influence of a demon. England and the Dutch Republic, which were already concerned about French expansion under Louis XIV, swiftly aligned themselves with the Austrian position. They were concerned that a union between France and Spain would result in the formation of an unbreakable Catholic power bloc. It was the accounts of the odd exorcisms performed on Charles II that had the greatest impact on the Protestant nations. These reports were exploited as propaganda to portray Catholic Europe as being superstitious and unstable. When opposing loyalties and practical reasons were taken into account, the Spanish nobles found themselves in a state of division. A significant number of individuals preferred the French candidate because they believed that Louis XIV military might provided the highest level of protection for Spanish possessions. The Austrian claim was supported by other individuals who argued that the continuation of Habsburg control was necessary for the preservation of Spanish independence and identity. A state of disarray prevailed among the Spanish administration as a result of the months of uncertainty surrounding Charles's passing. Because they were unable to show a unified front in the face of foreign interference, Portuguese and Italian territories that were part of the Spanish Empire started declaring their independence or switching allegiances almost quickly. As a result of the weakness that was revealed during Charles II's terminal illness, many regional leaders were worried that the Spanish central authority was falling apart, and they moved fast to secure their own positions that they had previously held. After the word of the king's passing traveled around the world, the empire that had once been the most powerful in the world began to fall apart gradually. The immediate and severe repercussions on the economy were felt everywhere. Trade in Spanish colonial territories, which had already been affected by months of uncertainty regarding the succession, came to a virtual halt as merchants and colonial authorities waited to see which European force would ultimately control their territory. On European markets, the price of Spanish government bonds plummeted, and a number of big banking institutions were in danger of going bankrupt as a result of their exposure to Spanish debt. The conflict that had begun as a disagreement over who would succeed the throne had developed into open warfare, spanning many continents by the spring of 1701. Over the course of more than a decade, the War of Spanish Succession would rage, ultimately changing the balance of power in Europe and establishing Britain as the preeminent naval force. An international conflict that would result in the loss of millions of lives and completely alter the modern world was sparked by the death of a single monarch who had been genetically deformed. The death of Charles II not only signified the end of his own life, but also signaled the end of one of the most powerful ruling dynasties in the history of the world, the Spanish Habsburgs. These Habsburgs had ruled over large areas across Europe and the Americas, having been subjected to the genetic effects of their systematic inbreeding for more than 2 centuries. Asia and Africa had finally given in to the consequences. As a final heir, the dynasty that had once bragged that the sun never set on their dominion had produced a person who was so physically and emotionally crippled that he could not function as a human being, let alone as a monarch. Through the use of contemporary genetic analysis, the archives of the Habsburg family shed light on the entire extent of the biological catastrophe that resulted in Charles II's illness. Researchers have shown that his genetic makeup was comparable to that of a child who was born to parents who were full siblings. This level of inbreeding almost certainly resulted in serious developmental issues for the child. The practice of marrying close relatives among the Habsburgs, which was designed to maintain political ties and concentrate power, had instead resulted in the creation of a genetic bottleneck that made it practically impossible to produce healthy heirs. The immediate political repercussions of Charles II's death are only a small part of the historical significance of his passing. His death heralded the beginning of a new era in European politics, one in which dynastic claims would be increasingly challenged by considerations of military might, economic interests, and national identity. His demise marked the beginning of this new period. The peculiar events that transpired during his dying months, and especially the public exorcisms, became emblematic of the superstition and backwardness that Enlightenment intellectuals would use to argue for more rational approaches to the administration of government and society. The medical elements of Charles's condition have continued to captivate researchers for centuries after they were first discovered. It is one of the most extensive medical investigations of the effects of severe inbreeding, and it provides vital insights into hereditary illnesses that would not be fully understood until the development of modern genetics. His autopsy report is one of the oldest examples of this. As a sharp reminder of the biological limitations that confine even the most powerful political institutions, the horrifying bodily and mental decline that he underwent serves as a stark reminder. As a result of the Spanish Succession War, which took place after Charles's death, the worldwide balance of power was changed in ways that continue to have an impact on international affairs today. As a result of the conflict, Britain became the preeminent naval power. French leadership in continental Europe was maintained for an entire generation, and the decline of Spanish imperial power was initiated. It was also the beginning of really global warfare, with battles being fought in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and other colonial countries. The war coincided with the beginning of the war. Perhaps most significantly, the hideous spectacle that was Charles II's dying months contributed to the acceleration of the philosophical shifts that would come to define the Enlightenment. Critics of conventional authority were given great ammunition when they saw the image of Europe's most powerful Catholic monarchy reduced to performing public exorcisms on a king who was nearing the end of his life. As evidence that rational reason should take the place of religious dogma in things pertaining to government, philosophers and political theorists would appeal to the desperate superstitions that were practiced by the Spanish court. In addition to this, the legacy of Charles II highlights. As a result of absolute power and dynastic ambition, the human cost is high. His life, which was defined from birth by grave defects and continuous misery, was sacrificed in order to sustain the myth of Habsburg legitimacy. On the other hand, the courtiers who surrounding him were more concerned with gaining political advantage from his condition than they were with giving him with humane medical care. His life serves as a reminder that even kings and emperors are, at the end of the day, human beings who are like everyone else and that they are capable of suffering and dying. Soon after his passing, Charles II began to be transformed from a real person into a historical icon. This transition began practically immediately after his death. Over the course of several decades, writers of the Enlightenment period began to use his story as an illustration of the decline of absolute monarchy. In spite of the fact that Catholic apologists maintained that his suffering was a sort of Christian martyrdom, these contrasting interpretations have continued to develop over time. Contemporary historians are striving to disentangle the historical facts from centuries of political and theological propaganda. We are forced to confront unsettling realities about power, suffering, and the human condition that have reverberated down the centuries as a result of the tragic closing days of Charles II of Spain. Despite the fact that he was born into the most privileged position possible, the heir to the largest empire in the world, surrounded by unbounded money and ultimate authority, he was destined to live a life of unremitting physical misery and mental suffering because of the very genetic lineage that gave him his throne. The attitude of the Spanish court to Charles's illness displays the most reprehensible features of human nature when it comes to dealing with the loss of power and the realization of one's own mortality. Instead of treating their king with sympathetic end-of-life care, his courtiers subjected him to more cruel treatments in an attempt to extract political advantage from his suffering. This was done in a desperate attempt to gain political advantage. A dying man's pain was transformed into entertainment for the nobility through the use of public exorcisms, which were performed for the sake of political theater as much as for the purpose of spiritual cure. The horrifying medical procedures that were performed on Charles served to bring to our attention the fact that genetic variety is not only a biological idea, but rather an essential prerequisite for human development. It was the systematic inbreeding of the Habsburg family, which was performed for political rather than biological reasons, that resulted in a genetic calamity that culminated in Charles's hideous physical and mental abnormalities. He provides a compelling illustration of the significance of genetic variation in human communities through the case that he has presented. The political repercussions of the death of a single individual, which included a war that would last for more than a decade and disrupt the global balance of power, are illustrative of how the fallibility of a single human being may set off tremendous historical shifts. The inability of Charles to produce an heir, which was directly tied to his hereditary impairments, resulted in a succession crisis that European powers had been anticipating for years. His death served as the impetus for hostilities that would ultimately determine the fate of nations and empires. The story of Charles II questions our preconceived notions about authority, which is perhaps the most crucial aspect of the story. Advancing civilization and progress. The court was surrounded by art, learning, and culture, and it was considered to be one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. When confronted with the illness of their monarch, however, they resorted to the medieval superstitions and cruel pseudo-medical remedies that were available to them. The disparity between their scientific knowledge and their conduct demonstrates how rapidly civilized cultures can revert to primitive behaviors when they are confronted with the reality of their own mortality and the disintegration of their core beliefs. Despite the prevalence of political and historical analysis, it is imperative that the personal aspect of Charles's story not be overlooked. His titles and privileges did not change the fact that he was, at the end of the day, a human being who endured a great deal of suffering throughout his brief existence. His final months, which were marked by physical misery, mental bewilderment, and the desperate interventions of those around him, are representative of a sort of suffering that transcends historical periods and social positions. Charles's narrative serves as a reminder that death is something that happens to everyone, regardless of their riches or position, in an age that frequently appears to be obsessed with power and status. Charles II left behind a legacy that continues to have an impact on our understanding of human nature, politics, and genetics. Medical specialists who are exploring the effects of inbreeding, political scientists who are investigating the collapse of dynasties, and historians who are attempting to comprehend the shift from medieval to modern Europe have all investigated his case. Both his life and his death provide us with a lens through which we might investigate more fundamental problems of power, pain, and the dignity of the human person. Ultimately, the dreadful closing days of Charles II of Spain serve as both a historical curiosity and a timeless moral lesson. They are both worthy of consideration. They bring to our attention the fact that people who hold absolute power are not the only ones who are corrupted by it. Those who facilitate it are also corrupted, that genetic heritage cannot be changed without consequences, and that compassion is due to human suffering regardless of the political circumstances being present. Despite the fact that Charles II was the last member of the Spanish Habsburg family, the lessons that he learned during his life and death continue to reverberate throughout history. These teachings serve as a cautionary tale about the perils of unbridled power and the significance of maintaining human dignity in the face of death.